So the topic of this morning's lesson is being grace dependent. The government would have us be dependent on a number of things, whether it's social welfare or shots or whatever the circumstances might be. But trying to get aside from that, I think we're all very much grace dependent. But sometimes we have some difficulty in acknowledging that, and sometimes we even find being grace dependent somewhat offensive. And I know that doesn't sound logical, but I think if you'll listen to me and some of the thoughts that I'll be sharing with you this morning, you'll see where I'm coming from. The text of the message this morning is taken from the New Testament book of Matthew, chapter 20, verses 13 through 15. But he, referring to Jesus, and this is a parable that Jesus is saying, but he answered one of them, "Friend, I'm not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the man who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" I think I may have told you this story, but when I was 5 years old, I was drafted to play right field for the Cubs in the t-shirt division of my local Little League. I grew up in a community called Bellflower. It's about 20 miles just this side of Los Angeles. And I can tell you that I wasn't a very good baseball player, unless you consider picking dandelions out in the outfield the makings of maybe a future Hall of Famer. Okay, well then I was a Hall of Famer. But it really didn't matter, because the team that I played on, the Cubs, we finished first that year, first place. And I know that for a fact because I was handed a trophy. It said we were the winners of the t-shirt division. But later, when I went to my best friend Rob's house, after the season was over, I saw that Rob had a first place trophy too. The problem is that Rob was a Dodger. Boo. Turns out everyone got a trophy. I mean, it was a real kindergarten scandal. And I've since gotten over the ordeal. Fortunately, it didn't leave me with any long-lasting scars. But do you remember the time when you studied really, really hard, especially for that math test? The one that you, because you studied so hard, aced, and everyone else bombed. Do you remember that time? Since the teacher gave everybody the opportunity to do a retake, and everyone wound up with the same grade as you. Or maybe it was the time at work when you were assigned this team project, and you were the one of the who put in the long hours. You carried the load for the team. But when it was all got the same praise, and the whole team got the same raise. It's not fair, is it? And if any of those sound vaguely familiar to you, then I want you to listen to this one, because it's a real doozy. You see, there was this farmer who went to town early one morning to hire some workers to pick grapes in his vineyard. Now, picking grapes in the Palestine area is hard work. principally because in Palestine during the grape harvest season, it can get to be upwards of 100 degrees, maybe even hotter, while you're picking grapes. And so, number one, it's hot. And making matters worse, a grape harvest is a really super hectic time of year since there's this very narrow window of opportunity between the harvest, the brix, B-R-I-X, which is basically the sugar content of the grape itself, and the onset of bad weather. So this grape harvest that's going on, you've got hot weather, but you have to hurry up and get the harvest in because the sugar content is just, wait too long, it can also bring bad weather, which would destroy the harvest altogether. So you have to hurry and get the grapes in. So in his haste to get the job done quickly, completely and thoroughly, the farmer went back into town at 9 o'clock in the morning and hired some more workers. He did the same thing again at noon. He did the same thing again at 3. He did the same thing again at 5 o'clock that evening, just an hour before quitting time. He hired even more workers. And I guess maybe from the story, it helps living close to town. I mean, if he can go into town that often and hire all these workers. But the original workers started at 6 in the morning. He gets more at 9, he gets more at noon, he gets more at 3, and he gets even more at 5. This farmer was committed to bringing in the harvest. At 6 o'clock, the farmer tells the foreman to call it quits for the day and to give everyone their pay. But uncharacteristically, he tells the paymaster to start with the workers who were hired last. And this kind of struck all of the workers being a bit odd, since usually when it came to payday, it was first come, first served. So you would think that the workers who started at 6 o'clock in the morning would be the first on the payroll to get paid for that day. But, they weren't ones to complain because at least they weren't getting stiffed, which happened from time to time during a grape harvest. So it didn't really matter what time you started during the day, at least you were standing in line to get your paycheck. So they all watched really curiously as the foreman begins to hand out the paychecks, and they noticed that the guys who had worked only 1 hour were paid, as the parable says, a denarius. A denarius was the equivalent of a day's wage. Or in California, these days at $13 an hour, it would be a paycheck of $4. That was an unbelievable wage back then, and maybe today if you think about it. In fact, that was the same wage that they paid a Roman soldier. And it was way more than you would ever expect to be paid as a laborer, even for an entire day's work. But I'm thinking that the other laborers are watching this payday scenario unfold and probably didn't mind too much, at least not yet, because they were probably flabbergasted at the owner's generosity, especially the guys who'd been working there since sunrise. These guys likely ran a few calculations in their head and thought, oh, if those guys who were only got $104 and I've been working for 12 hours, 12 times $104 is a lot of money. Cha-ching. I'm going to make it big. God bless this farmer for being so generous. But when they got to the cashier, they got the same amount and their paycheck, $104. Suffice it to say that the boys who had been there since 6 in the morning were just a little steamed, and one of them let the farmer have it. But not surprisingly, the farmer's response was equally as telling, because as soon as the laborer lets the farmer have it, here's what the farmer says. He responds graciously by calling him friend, and then asked him 3 questions, which at the time and even today, I don't know that you have a lot of Jewish friends, but that is the way that they engage in conversation. They ask questions. For instance, when Jesus was in the temple, it says that he was asking questions of rabbis. That was a very Jewish way of doing things. In fact, I have a story told is all of Jewish people answer a question with a question, and the response was, "Why do you ask?" So, I mean, that's just the way their culture is. So this farmer asks the laborer 3 questions. The first is, didn't you agree to work for $104 today? Yes, I did. Strike 1. The next question is, don't I have the right to do with my money as I choose? Well, it's the farmer's money, so the answer would be, yes, you do. Strike 2. And the last question is, are you envious because I'm jealous or because I'm generous? Well, at that, the worker ends up being caught looking. Strike 3, he's out. And you're thinking, hey, that sounds a lot like that Little League story, or that sounds a lot like everyone getting an A on the when I studied the harvest, or that reminds me of that rate increase, even though I was the only one who put in all the hard work. That kind of story bothers us, I think. And for some of us, it bothers us a lot. It bothers us because when you're talking about a Little League game, or you're talking about a grade on a test, or even workers in this parable, there's certain rules. One team really does score more runs than the other. One person really does get more questions right on the test than others. And one person really does work longer and harder and deserves more pay. But Jesus isn't talking about earthly rules here. He's talking about standards, for that matter. He's talking about heavenly matters, because that's how Jesus starts the parable. For the kingdom of heaven is like, and therein lies the problem. The problem is that even when Jesus tells us point blank what he's talking about, we're way too stuck in our own little world to actually hear it, much less. Jesus ends the parable with the question, or are you envious because I'm generous? Perhaps the real problem is not so much with God's generosity or even his sense of fairness. Maybe the problem is with his grace, as it exposes from time to time our selfishness in making it all about us. It's about me. And I want you to go home today and just, if you would please, read Matthew chapter 19. Because I want you to understand the context in which this parable is being told. to the readers. Because minutes earlier, Peter, chapter verse 20, we up and follow you, what will we get? And then, no sooner had Jesus finished his story than James and Johnny's mommy comes and talks to Jesus and says in Matthew chapter 20, verse 41, in your kingdom, Jesus, let my two sons sit in places of honor next to you, one on your right and one on your left. It is no wonder that 3 verses later, Matthew would say that the other disciples, including Matthew himself, were indignant. Maybe that's why Jesus concludes his discussion by observing in Matthew chapter 19, verse 16, those who are last now will be first then, and those who are first will be last. And I think sometimes that offends us. And I know that that sounds a bit absurd because we love grace, don't we? I mean, how could grace possibly be offensive? We sing about grace and call it a. We say grace and then we eat our meal. We even quote scripture that says, by grace we have been saved. And that's all good, so long as grace remains just a nice word that we use in church. But what if someone hurts you? What if someone really offends you? How do you respond then? Do you offer grace and forgiveness to that person? Or do you find it absurd that God would actually expect you to let that assailant or that offender off the hook? I mean, they hurt you, right? They don't deserve your grace, do they? Or what if God blesses someone financially while you're teetering on the brink of bankruptcy? Or that it's not your own? You see, when we actually encounter pure, unadulterated grace, we sometimes find it a wee bit offensive. In fact, we hardly have a category for it, like this particular story. On the evening of November 3rd, a carload of bored teenagers decided to find a little excitement. So they started by breaking into a car and stealing stuff, which also happened to include a credit card. They then went to a video store and charged $400 worth of DVDs and video games against the credit card. But that wasn't enough. They decided they needed a little bit more fun. So they headed to a grocery store where they bought a 20-pound butterball frozen turkey and set off down the highway. Now, about this same time, a 44-year-old woman was headed home in her car, having attended her niece's music recital. And when asked about it later, Victoria Ruvolo said that she didn't remember a speeding car approaching her, that she didn't remember a teenage boy hanging out of the window, and she most certainly did not remember a 20-pound frozen turkey come crashing through her windshield, despite the fact that the turkey struck her directly and broke every bone with which it came into contact. The incident left Victoria with absolutely no memory of the event whatsoever. Surgery, titanium plates put in her face, an eye that had to be reattached by synthetic film, a wired jaw, and a tracheotomy. Victoria then began the excruciating process of rehab. Later, friends and then family would explain to Victoria that an 18-year-old punk named Ryan Cushing had thrown the 20-pound turkey through the windshield of her car for absolutely no reason whatsoever. None. But after 9 agonizing months spent recovering from her hellacious injuries, Victoria finally had the chance to meet Ryan face to face. All places, courtroom. She watched intently as Ryan accepted a plea bargain and the sentence for his crimes. 6 months in jail, 5 years probation, some counseling, and a few hours of community service. And you're thinking, what? In jail, 5 years probation, some counseling, and a few hours of community service? That's our justice system about anyway. I mean, who thinks in their right mind that 6 months in jail even to come close to paying for destroying someone else's face? Well, Victoria Ruvolo thought that that was appropriate because she had asked the court to be lenient on the defendant. And after the sentencing, Ryan Cushing, that guy, walked across the courtroom, hugged Victoria, and bawled his eyes out like a baby. And Victoria told Ryan, I forgive you. I want your life to be the best that it can be. I don't know about you, but that's great. But that's also offensive and a little outrageous, isn't it? Aren't we just a little disturbed that Ryan's sentence was only obeyed, a little counseling and a wee bit of community service? Where's that? But that's what happens when we encounter grace that has been unleashed. We hardly know what to do with it. You see, the problem is not with grace. The problem is with hearts. And Jesus reminds if grace offends us, because you and me are wholly dependent upon it. Even upon the owner to give them a job. And let's face it, if that farmer had not hired workers, if they didn't work, they didn't eat. And they had zero qualifications, nada, nilch, nothing. But the farmer offered to pay them more than they deserved. In other words, who work, think, are the most deserving, were still only there because of the owner's grace. And when I look back on it, the same is true for me and the Cubbies. We thought that we were the best team, but the truth is, by standards, we were horrible. In fact, as far as I know, there's made it to the major leagues. I mean, we had a hard enough time running the bases in the right direction, right? Much less getting the ball to first base. The only reason Cubbies got a trophy was because of the league's grace. And no matter religious, spiritual, we think we all are, we are because of grace. We are utterly, totally dependent on God's grace. So, church, be captivated by God's grace, because He pursued you and He pursued me. We turned our backs on Him. Even though you had nothing to offer, and then be saved by God's grace. He loved you so much that He gave His only Son to pay for your sin. Yes. Are we grace dependent? Absolutely. And does that bother you still? I hope not. We need God's grace. It is amazing grace. Don't let it be something that you just sing about in church. Manifest it when you're out with others. Dispense it for people who don't deserve it. Share it with people who could really use an encouraging word. Model it for people who are looking for an example that when life throws you all sorts of curveballs, that you can be there. And although you might want to be the umpire and call the balls and call the strikes, let them walk. Let them get to first base. Let them swing and hit the home run. Let them be a child of God, and let them know that they are loved unconditionally. Because so were you, and so was I. Don't forget where you came from. And most importantly, don't forget where you're going. But let's not be a club and be the only ones who are going. I heard a joke one time about, let's see, it was a member of, it was a group of believers that were at the gate. You know, you always see Heaven's Gate, and there's Peter at the gate and letting people in the gate. And so somebody said, like, wow, there's a lot more people than I ever thought were going to be here. And Peter said, shh, don't tell the members of the Church of Christ, because they think they're the only ones who are going to go. Don't be a club. Share God's grace with whomsoever you come into contact. Invite them here. Invite them to be part of this family. Invite them to allow us to love on them and miss them if they're not here, or to pray for them if they're ill. Don't leave this place and keep it a secret. Take God's grace with you and share it. And you will truly be amazed at the transformative properties that God's grace will have in that person and also with you.